The Lighthouse Thomsons. Being the story of the Thomson family and their long connection with lighthouses and the sea. Any story needs a beginning, and ours starts with James Thomson, who was a lighthouse keeper and spent 25 years on the Kintyre Lights. He married Jane Cummings, a lass from the Isle of Man at Ramsay, on the 1st of June 1858. Theirs seems to have been a happy match, and James lived until February 1914, when he died at Fiorline at the south end of Kintyre, aged 79 years. James and Jane Thomson had a son whom they named Alexander, who was born on the 19th of June 1860 at the Point of Ayre Lighthouse on the Isle of Man, where his father was then keeper of the light. When he grew up, Alexander appears to have had close contact with his father's lighthouse colleagues. One such was a man called William Tulloch, who by all contemporary accounts was described as a heavy man but very agile. Apparently Tulloch was one of the very best at collecting seabirds' eggs, for which there was always a demand from visitors to the island. As a young man, Alexander Thomson would accompany Tulloch on many occasions, but especially when he went to collect eggs. Alexander did not become a lighthouse keeper immediately, but served his time as a plumber, and during the 1880s worked on various installations during the building of the lighthouse on Ailsa Craig. This period was important in his life, as it was while working on this project he met a young lady called Elizabeth Gregg, whose father, Alexander Gregg, was the first lighthouse keeper on Ailsa Craig. Elizabeth had been born at Sleat on the Isle of Skye, possibly when her father was a lighthouse keeper there. Alexander Thomson and Elizabeth were married on the 19th of July 1886 and were actually the first couple to be married on Ailsa Craig. A short time after their marriage, Alexander joined the lighthouse service himself, and he remained a keeper for almost 38 years. There are archived images of Alexander in his uniform, with some of his colleagues and also of some family groups dating from the 1890s. Alexander and Elizabeth had 10 children, and although a large family was not uncommon in Victorian Scotland, it could be suggested that in their case there may have been little else to do on the remote island. 4 of their children were born on Ailsa Craig. James, their firstborn, was delivered in Girvan in the home of William Girvan, the Ailsa Craig boatman at the time, apparently as a precaution against any unforeseen complications. After what must at that time have been a somewhat hard life, they had been married for 43 years when Elizabeth died on the 12th of October 1929 at the age of 62. James outlived her for another 2 years when he too passed away on the 19th of December 1931, aged 74 years. Both Alexander and Elizabeth are interred in the Doon Cemetery in Girvan. James Thomson. Their first son, James Thomson, who has already been mentioned, had been born in Girvan on the 11th of August 1887 in the home of James Girvan and was boarded by the Girvan family. During his first year at school, despite William Girvan having 12 children of his own in the early 1970s, James wrote his reminiscences for the Lighthouse Journal. He describes his summers as absolute bliss, spending a great deal of time at the lobster creels and fishing. As he became older and stronger, he would row the boat out to the lobster creels. Time was also spent catching puffins for bait and for their feathers. Sadly, about this period, one of William Girvan's sons met with a fatal accident at the Curling Stone Quarry on Ailsa Craig, when a black powder blasting charge exploded in his face and he fell to his death on the rocks below. James Thomson formed a very close relationship with his younger brother Craig. It appears they were very different in looks, with James being fair and shy, but steady, whereas Craig was dark of skin, hair and eyes. Craig was a very bright lad, but was inclined to be impudent, always getting up to mischief whenever the opportunity would arise. Ailsa Craig was visited by a Charles Kirk, a taxidermist by profession, but also a talented photographer, who had established a business in Glasgow in 1896. He started to make visits to Ailsa Craig in order to photograph the wildlife in a natural setting. His main purpose in these trips was in helping to publish illustrated books and to build static exhibitions of the birds in as natural a setting as possible. James Thomson often accompanied Kirk on his photographic missions, carrying the bulky and very heavy plate camera equipment used at that time. We can be grateful to Charles Kirk for recording aspects of the childhoods of James and the Thomson siblings in his photographs. Unlike many others of the time, we are fortunate to know a great deal about James, or Jim as he was known, thanks to his daughter Ruth Thomson, who recorded much of the early family history in a book entitled Stranger to the Land. Within this publication, Ruth describes her early childhood at various lighthouses in Scotland, followed by her family's emigration to the Canadian prairies in 1927. Their emigration was apparently arranged through the Soldiers' Settlement Fund. According to Ruth, her father James Thomson was the only member of his family to join the Lighthouse service. On leaving school, he had worked for a short time with his uncle, who had a workshop in Girvan. Later, after serving an apprenticeship as a machinist with David Rowan Marine Engineers and Boilermakers of Glasgow between 1905 and 1910, he finally joined the Lighthouse service in 1912. This maintained the family tradition, following in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather. His first posting was as relief keeper to Rattray Headlight, Fair Isles, in 1912, followed by postings to the Var, the Isle of May, and finally New Artach in 1925. His service had been broken in the outbreak of World War I, when he enlisted in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. He was wounded in France and sent on recuperation, leaving to Liverpool, where he met and married the young Frances West, a teacher, on the 29th of December 1917, when he was 30 years old. Eventually, as earlier referred to by Ruth, through the Soldiers' Settlement Board, the family settled on their quarter section of land in Alticane, Saskatchewan, in April 1927. They were supplied with old machinery, 3 cows, 4 horses and a 4-apartment house. Unfortunately, James struggled to make the poor land productive, and eventually, after 12 years of effort, he was forced to give up and move to Vancouver, British Columbia in 1939. On the outbreak of World War II, James joined the Canadian Army's Ordnance Corps in 1941 and served with them till the end of the war. James Thomson returned to the Lighthouse service, keeping lights on the Pacific coast on various islands until 1952. Very often he had to rely on his family members for assistance on these lonely postings, but he must have loved the sea, as even when he retired officially, he still carried out occasional relief work for several years. Let us now turn to James Thomson's sibling, Alexander Craig Thomson, best known simply as Craig. You will recollect that James had been born in Girvan, but brother Craig was the first child born on Ailsa Craig, exactly 2 years later than James to the day, on the 11th of August 1889. Craig's story is a main feature of the Thomson family history. James related to one of the first incidents concerning his brother Craig when he was only 5 years old. One summer's day in Ailsa Craig, when the brothers were trying to climb out of a boat tied up at the pier. It was a boat which was used for lobster fishing. As he reached out of the boat to grab hold of the side of the wharf, Craig fell into the water and spent about 4 minutes floating face down on the water. The Ailsa Craig boatman Andrew Girvan pulled him out of the water and threw him over his shoulder to clear his lungs. Fortunately, he was none the worse for his experience, as he spent the next 55 years at sea. In June 1915, Craig Thomson enlisted as a private in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders at Swindon. A month later, he was promoted to sub-lieutenant and joined HMS Fox, which was listed then as a second-class cruiser, which was in active service at the beginning of October. For his first 2 years, Craig served in the East Indies and Egyptian waters, followed by a 3rd year in the Red Sea. It is recorded that his service ended in August of 1918 when HMS Fox docked at Bombay, India. Craig's actual service record indicates that for some misdemeanour he was court-martialed. and was sentenced to 1 year imprisonment and decommissioned from the service in disgrace. He served part of his sentence on HMS Venus and probably completed it in England. Craig Thomson's life was full of surprises, and one particular event could have proved to be a scriptwriter's dream. He was married while docked in China to the love of his life, a Russian girl not yet 18 years old. He had been in a bar where he encountered a singer a few years older than himself. This led to a romance, and he asked the lady to marry him and agreed that they would meet in a church for the ceremony. Well, the lady turned out to be a bit devious, and at the ceremony substituted her young daughter Annie in the hope that she would find a better life outside China by marrying a British citizen. Young Annie's mother and father had actually fled from Russia to China during the Russian Revolution, and now with no means of leaving China, the mother, who was a trained singer, sang there to make a living. Annie, while apparently a beautiful girl, turned out to be a somewhat undisciplined young woman, which led to a stormy marriage. And according to Craig's family, she possessed an explosive temper. Craig and Annie had a daughter also named Annie, who was educated in a number of different convents close to the Yangtze River. By the summer of 1926, the family were staying in Girvan with Craig's parents in their home in Dalrymple Street. The purpose of their trip to Britain was apparently to attend an important meeting in London. The reason for this meeting is unrecorded and for some reason remained a family secret. However, other factors affecting Craig Thomson's life were recorded. Recent research has uncovered that in a letter from the Admiralty dated 6th of May 1927, Captain Craig Thomson was requested to attend at Buckingham Palace, where decorations and medals were awarded to the officers and men of His Majesty's Navy and Mercantile Marine Service at Buckingham Palace in recognition of his service and conduct on board the SS Wanshine. Captain Alexander Craig Thomson received the Distinguished Service Cross for the part he played in the fight against Chinese rebels. For those interested, a full account of the incident leading to this award, which took place on the Yangtze River on the 5th of September 1926, can be viewed on the internet. During the early 1930s, Craig is recorded as living at his parents' address while recovering from a serious illness for a period of 2 months. Later in the decade, he served on cargo ships crossing the Atlantic. We know of 2 of these vessels, one being the Silver Sandal and the second being the Silver Fir. This latter vessel was actually sunk by the German surface raider Scharnhorst on the 16th of March 1942, whilst en route from Manchester to New York. During the 1930s, Craig and Annie divorced, and it's interesting to note that following the divorce, Annie was to marry a total of 7 times. As for Craig himself, by 1937 the records show that he was working out of Shanghai as master of the ship Dupina. Nothing further is heard of his family until just before the fall of Hong Kong to the Japanese. Apparently, Annie's then husband, an American naval officer, had arranged for the family's evacuation to San Francisco. Craig's daughter Annie, however, refused to leave the colony until she heard from her father. Annie just made the last ship out of Hong Kong, but sadly she never heard from her father again. For whatever reasons, none of Craig Thomson's relations heard anything about his worldwide movements during the years of the Second World War. His missions seem to have been steeped in mystery, but this wasn't unusual given the times. For example, on one occasion while in Vancouver in Canada, he was unaware that his brother James, or Jim, was serving in the army there also, and they failed to meet up. Despite everything else, Captain Alexander Craig Thomson's greatest feat during World War II was when he sailed the ship Algama with a crew of 17 volunteers from the River Clyde in Scotland round the Cape of Good Hope to Alexandretta in Turkey. The Algama had been built at Lammett's Yard in Greenock and fitted out as a sheer leg vessel designed to work in sheltered waters such as a river environment only. She was not supposed to be suitable for ocean going. A newspaper report in the Army News from Darwin Territories dated Saturday the 16th of October 1943 provided the following details of his heroic voyage. Captain Craig Thomson of the British Merchant Navy has left in Turkey an egg-shaped crane ship which he took 15,200 miles to its destination. Never before had a ship of this design been put to sea, and from the air it would have looked turtle-shaped. The twin funnels were modified and were placed side by side. As the decks were so close to the waterline, they were continually awash, and it was necessary for the crew's accommodation to be sealed and air-conditioned. The ship called into at least 21 ports of Africa during the 10-month voyage in order to take on coal and supplies. The south coast ports of Africa proved to be the most difficult to negotiate due to the strength of the surf. Captain Thomson only encountered enemy shipping once off Point Noir in French Equatorial Africa. Craig saw a submarine periscope, but it submerged immediately. On reaching Point Noir, he saw one ship which had been struck with a torpedo and learned that another ship was hit and sank the following day. Captain Thomson had been at sea for 10 months, and this was his only encounter. Banquets were held to honour the crew at Alexandretta, and various newspaper reports were carried throughout the world. On the 17th of December 1943, a report from George Waiters, who had been on board the Algama, related his version of the epic voyage, which was printed in the Troy Record of New York City. The story was repeated in the Lima News of Ohio on the 21st of February 1944, possibly inserted by someone having local connections. At some point in his epic career, Captain Craig Thomson was presented with a silver sword. Unfortunately, this important item was stolen during a burglary at the home of Craig's sister Elizabeth, or Lily Thomson, the wife of William Hislop, MBE, while they lived at Shallock Mill in Girvan. The last part of Craig Thomson's working life was spent in Hong Kong, working on passenger ferries, and there is a last photograph of him with Jennifer Jones during the filming of Love is a Very Splendid Thing, on board SS Fatchan, dated March 1955. The rest of the clan. Jane Cumming Thomson. Jane was born in Ailsa Craig on the 19th of July 1891 and is interred in New Zealand, where she passed away on the 16th of October 1981, aged 90 years. Robert Gregg Thomson. Robert was born in Ailsa Craig on the 31st of January 1893 and joined the Merchant Navy. Sadly, he is recorded as having been lost at sea in 1941, aged only 21 years. Margaret Gregg Thomson. Born at 6 Greenside, Girvan on the 8th of December 1894, Margaret was the person who made a late attempt in 1969 to find out about her only surviving seafaring brother Craig in Hong Kong. The local seaman's mission forwarded details of the captain's current circumstances of himself and his wife, and they appeared to be in poor condition. Craig died on his 80th birthday on the 11th of August 1969. As for Margaret, she eventually passed away at Collintrive, Argyll, Scotland. John Wright Thomson. Known to the family as Jack, he was born in Ailsa Craig on the 12th of November 1897. Like his elder brother Robert, he joined the Merchant Navy and sadly also became a victim of the sea. He died off the coast of South America and is buried there. Elizabeth or Lily Thomson. Lily was born in Ailsa Craig on the 13th of June 1899. It's believed she spent her entire life in Scotland, and at the age of 32 she married William Hislop, MBE. They lived at Shallock Mill, just outside Girvan. At the time of her marriage, Lily lived at 9 Henrietta Street, Girvan, and it appears that a witness to the marriage, Margaret S. Gregg, lived at the same address. Lily died on the 30th of May 1961 at the age of 62. She is interred in the family plot at Doon Cemetery, Girvan. Andrew Thomson. Andrew was born at 22 Montgomery Street, Girvan on the 19th of June 1902. Another engineer, he spent time in England before emigrating to New Zealand. His daughter and family paid a visit to Girvan in July 1992. The family wrote a letter to the staff of the McKechnie Institute in Girvan looking for their help. Andrew and his sister Jane are both interred in New Zealand, where he died on the 18th of May 1980. Isabella Gregg Thomson. Born at 26 Harbour Street, Girvan on the 10th of May 1908, Isabella died as an infant from diphtheria on the 6th of January 1912, aged only a little more than 3.5 years. She is interred beside her parents in the west section of Doon Cemetery, Girvan. George Gregg Thomson. George was the last child born in Scotland at 26 Harbour Street, Girvan on the 22nd of September 1909. He passed away in Ayr 1979, aged 70 years. The island that names babies, sailing off into the sunset.